Welcome to the debate.
Glad to be here for this one.
You are listening to the WeCyberYou Unlocked podcast. And for those keeping track of our pronunciation at home, that is WeCyberYou.
Always good to get that right off the bat.
Exactly. So traditionally, when we talk about keeping information safe, we focus really heavily on, the mechanism of the lock.
Right, the perimeter defenses.
Yeah. We buy heavier padlocks, we build thicker steel doors, set up these incredibly complex intrusion detection systems, and we just sort of assume the secret is safe.
It is a very binary mindset, I think. The door is locked or it is unlocked. The data is secured or it is breached.
Right.
We've spent decades finding this sort of engineering comfort in that state.
But, step into the modern digital economy, and you quickly realize the person holding the key to that vault is, they are legally selling blueprints of the room.
Oh, absolutely. And handing out detailed descriptions of the contents to the highest bidder.
Yes, so the strength of the lock really does not matter if the fundamental handling of the information is flawed from the inside.
We have basically mastered locking the digital door while completely ignoring the behavior of the people we actually invited inside.
Which brings us to the core tension we are analyzing in today's discussion. We are examining ISO 27071.
Right, the big one.
Yeah, the international standard that extends traditional information security into privacy protection, creating a Privacy Information Management System, or a PIMS.
A PIMS, right.
So the central question for this debate is this. Does integrating privacy directly into existing security frameworks via ISO 27701 successfully bridge the gap between technical security and ethical data governance?
Or, on the flip side, does bolting privacy onto a security standard actually limit an organization's ability to truly respect user privacy?
Right. And I argue that ISO 27701 is a necessary, highly structured evolution. Security alone is just totally inadequate given today's massive data collection.
I hear that, but
by layering privacy onto ISO 27001, we take these abstract privacy laws and we make them operational, measurable, and crucially, auditable.
And I look at this entirely differently. Because ISO 27701 is an extension-like, it is not a standalone certification, and you have to implement it alongside ISO 27701. It fundamentally anchors privacy within a security paradigm.
Well, yes, that is the design.
But the danger there is that an organization can perfectly secure data using, state-of-the-art encryption, while holding data they ethically should never have collected in the first place.
I see where you were going with that.
Treating privacy as just an extension of security turns ethical governance into a technical checklist. I think it obscures much deeper, systemic privacy risks.
Let us look at how this functions architecturally, though, because the structure is the whole point here.
Okay, let us get into the architecture.
Think of ISO 27001 as that secure vault. It is the reinforced steel, the biometric scanners, the uncrackable safes.
Right, the traditional ISMS.
Exactly. ISO 27701 provides the strict rules governing who actually gets to put things in the vault, what specifically they are allowed to store, how long it stays there, and why it was brought into the building at all.
I see the metaphor, but I just do not buy the vault analogy.
Why not? It fits perfectly.
Because a vault is terminal, right? It is a destination meant for locking things away so they do not move.
Well, sure, but
data lifecycle management under ISO 27701 covers collection, processing, storage, sharing, and deletion. Data is highly, highly dynamic.
It is dynamic, yes.
So when you use a vault mentality, you are applying a containment philosophy to something that is fundamentally fluid.
But that fluidity is exactly why we need the rigorous control mechanisms of an international standard.
Is it, though?
Yes. Look, if data moves from a mobile application to a cloud server, then gets processed by an analytics engine, and finally shared with a marketing partner, ad hoc ethical guidelines just fall apart completely.
I'm not arguing for ad hoc guidelines, but
you need the structured discipline of security controls. Specifically, the Annex A controls of ISO 27001 mapped directly to privacy requirements to enforce mandates at every single node of that journey.
See, you are assuming a security-first framework actually prevents privacy breaches, rather than just securing the breached data better.
That is a bit reductive, do you not think?
Not at all. Let us evolve your metaphor. If data is fluid, applying ISO 27701 is like building a better, more secure pipe.
Okay, I will play along. A secure pipe.
You have ensured the water does not leak out of the pipe. You have tracked exactly where the pipe goes. But the framework still does not inherently question whether the water should be extracted from the lake in the first place.
Ah, but it does.
If an application collects highly sensitive location data, it absolutely does not need to function. That is a privacy violation at the exact moment of collection.
I am really not convinced by that line of reasoning, because you are completely ignoring the necessity requirement built directly into the standard's core capabilities.
The necessity test is often just a bureaucratic hurdle, though.
No. ISO 27701 does not allow a blank check for data collection. It explicitly mandates data minimization.
In theory.
In practice, an auditor looking at a PIMS will ask the engineering team, why are you ingesting this location data?
And the team will give a very polished, documented reason.
But if the answer is, oh, we might train an AI model on it next year, that totally fails the necessity test. The standard prevents the extraction before the water even reaches the pipe.
That assumes the auditor has the mandate and, frankly, the philosophical training to challenge the core business model rather than just checking if the data mapping policy matches the routing practice.
Auditors are trained to look for exactly that kind of overreach.
Maybe, but there is also a deeper technical friction here between security and privacy that ISO 27771 really struggles to resolve.
What kind of friction?
Security inherently wants to retain data. Think about forensic logging. An information security management system wants robust, immutable event logs to detect anomalies or investigate breaches.
Right? You need logs for visibility.
But privacy inherently wants data minimization. It wants that data gone, so you have a fundamental clash.
That tension definitely exists, yes. But ISO 27771 forces a reconciliation.
How so? By just putting them in the same binder?
No, by requiring you to apply privacy by design to those very security logs. You hash the identifiers, you implement strict retention schedules on the seam, and you mask the data.
Masking's just a band-aid, though.
It takes the philosophical conflict and solves it with actual engineering controls. That is the beauty of it.
Okay, but your vault and pipe analogies assume a single building or a single plumbing system. Modern data is not in one building.
Of course not. It is highly distributed.
Exactly. It is passing through APIs to dozens of third-party microservices. How does ISO 27701 maintain that rigid control when the data completely leaves the original host?
Well, that supply chain ambiguity is exactly the vulnerability ISO 27701 targets.
By just asking nicely for third-party audits?
By introducing clear, enforceable distinctions between PII controllers and PII processors.
Right, the GDPR terminology.
Yes. The controllers decide the why and how of processing. The processors handle the data strictly on behalf of the controllers.
Which is a nice clean map on paper.
It works. By forcing organizations to formally declare and document these roles, the standard maps beautifully to global regulations. It creates contractual obligations that follow the data across those APIs.
Okay, defining roles makes compliance scalable across the supply chain. I'll give you that.
It is essential for cross-border data transfer mechanisms.
But defining roles does not equal proper ethical handling.
How does it not? You are legally bound to your role.
Because in the ecosystem of massive global apps, the controllers are often monopolies, or, near monopolies. They write the terms of service.
Sure, the power dynamics are skewed.
They dictate the why and the how, and the consumer has zero leverage to negotiate.
Quote, improve user experience.
And they have to stand by that documentation in an audit.
They define the role, document the purpose, flow it down to their subprocessors, and boom, they are fully compliant with ISO 27701.
So you are saying they just paper over the issue?
Exactly. Does that standard actually curb the inherent risks of mass collection, or does it just give them a certified stamp of approval for doing it in the highly organized way?
I would frame it completely differently. You are looking at the standard as if it operates in a total vacuum.
I am looking at it in the real-world business context.
But ISO 27701 creates the infrastructure for accountability that regulators actually rely on to do their jobs.
Regulators are always 10 steps behind the engineers, though.
Before this framework, regulators walking into server rooms were completely blind. Now, the controller has to establish policies and integrate privacy impact assessments with their existing security risk methodologies.
Again, documented methodologies, not necessarily ethical ones.
They have to align their privacy practices with their business strategy in a documented way. If a controller is over-collecting data, the PIMS provides the exact audit trail needed to enforce the law.
I mean, stating intentions plainly is a step up from operating in the shadows. I will admit that.
It forces them to state their intentions plainly, on paper, under penalty of noncompliance. That is huge.
But I worry about the normalization of mass collection. When you build an industrial pipeline for data, even if you clearly label the pipes controller and processor,
Which provides clarity.
and maintain perfect API documentation, you are still running an industrial extraction pipeline. The standard gives a veneer of legitimacy to business models built entirely on surveillance.
We cannot uninvent the digital economy, though.
No, but we do not have to certify its worst impulses. The data extraction is happening regardless of whether we like the underlying business models. What we can do is demand transparency and enforce user rights.
Let us get into transparency then, because this is where the standard impacts the actual human being sitting at the end of the screen.
Right. ISO 27701 mandates robust consent management and real infrastructural support for user rights, access, correction, and the right to be forgotten. I approach this specific part with deep, deep skepticism.
You do not think supporting user rights is valuable?
Not the value of the rights themselves. Supporting access and deletion is obviously vital.
Okay, so where is the skepticism?
My skepticism lies in how this transparency is operationalized through the lens of privacy risk management within a security standard.
You are talking about how the standard asks organizations to identify risks and map them out,
Yes, you map them on a matrix of impact versus likelihood.
which is the gold standard for risk assessment.
When you integrate privacy into an information security management system, you inevitably inherit the ISMS methodology for risk. You put risks on a matrix. But we have to ask, impact to whom?
Well, the standard explicitly states the impact should be assessed from the perspective of the data subject, the individual whose privacy is actually at stake.
In theory, sure.
It is literally in the text of the standard.
In practice, when treated as a corporate compliance exercise, that matrix almost always reverts to measuring impact to the company.
I think that is an incredibly cynical take.
It is reality. What is the likelihood of a regulatory fine? What is the impact of reputational damage? This is the checkbox problem I mentioned earlier.
Organizations do not spend millions on ISO certification just to check a box.
A company calculates that the financial penalty for a slight overcollection of data is minimal compared to the massive profit generated by the AI profiling they can do with that data.
If an auditor catches that, they lose their certification.
They just check the compliance boxes, formally accept the risk in their risk register, and proceed with the collection. It becomes an actuarial calculation rather than a genuine ethical commitment to the user.
That is a highly, highly cynical view of how organizations approach this standard.
I call it pragmatic. Look at the fines handed out under GDPR. Companies just absorb them as the cost of doing business.
But obtaining and maintaining an ISO certification is incredibly resource intensive. Companies do not go through the pain of integrating ISO 27001, 27002, and 27701 just to create a cynical actuarial table.
Some definitely do.
They do it because privacy is a business-critical priority now. You mentioned the right to be forgotten earlier. Let us talk about the technical reality of that.
Okay, let us talk about deletion.
How do you actually reconcile a deletion request with decentralized microservices or immutable storage architectures like worm drives?
It requires massive architectural overhaul. You have to map the entire data lineage.
Exactly. You cannot fake a deletion architecture for an auditor.
Well, you can try, but it usually fails.
When an organization aligns with this framework, they spend millions re-architecting their databases so that when a user clicks delete my data, it cascades properly.
Through the primary servers.
Through the primary servers, the backups, and out to the third-party processors via API triggers.
It is a heavy lift, definitely.
It requires finding and neutralizing data across complex data lakes without breaking the referential integrity of the entire system. That is not a bureaucratic shield.
It is an engineering marvel, I will give you that.
That is real, tangible power being handed back to the user through sheer engineering force. You do not get that without a standard like ISO 27701 pushing the architecture.
I will concede that point. The engineering required to actually comply forces a level of operational maturity that does benefit the end user.
Thank you.
If you have to build a cascading delete function that actually works across distributed systems, you inherently understand your own data architecture better.
Exactly, which reduces shadow IT and stray data lakes.
But, and this is a big but, we cannot lose sight of the fact that this is still a framework rooted deeply in information security.
And security is a strong foundation.
Security is fundamentally about protecting assets. For a corporate entity, user data is an asset.
A highly regulated asset.
ISO 27701 helps companies protect their assets responsibly. Sure, but it still treats human privacy as a manageable asset class.
Treating it as a manageable asset class is exactly what allows us to protect it.
Or exploit it safely.
Look, if we leave privacy entirely in the realm of high-minded philosophy, nothing gets done.
We need ethics, not just engineering.
Engineers cannot code philosophy. Auditors cannot audit a moral feeling. Security frameworks operate on the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability.
The classics.
Privacy requires unlinkability, transparency, and intervenability. By translating the human right of privacy into the rigid language of risk management and structured life cycles, ISO 27701 bridges that gap.
It builds a bridge, yes.
It takes the ethical imperative and gives it real operational consequences.
We must evaluate these frameworks critically, though. We have to recognize that checking the boxes of technical security compliance should never become a clever disguise for mass data extraction.
I agree. It should not be a disguise.
A perfectly secure database full of over-collected, hyper-personal data is still a fundamental failure of privacy, even if it passes an ISO audit with flying colors.
As we draw this discussion toward a close, we are really looking at two very different perspectives on the exact same architecture.
Two sides of the same coin.
I firmly believe that integrating privacy into a proven security standard is the most realistic, structured, and auditable way to handle global data protection today.
It definitely brings order to the chaos.
It brings necessary engineering discipline to an incredibly chaotic digital landscape.
And I maintain that while these structural discipline is absolutely beneficial, we have to be incredibly careful not to let the technical language of security overshadow the fundamental human implications of privacy.
It is a delicate balance.
Compliance frameworks can't just be sophisticated ways to validate overcollection.
Yet, despite our different angles on the mechanics of it, we do have a very clear point of convergence here.
We do.
In an era defined by constant data leaks, really aggressive profiling, and intense regulatory pressure, simply securing data from outside threat actors is just woefully inadequate.
The perimeter is not enough anymore.
Right. Privacy is a fundamental, business-critical priority that has to be woven into the fabric of the organization.
On that, we are in complete agreement. A strong lock really does not excuse bad behavior inside the house.
So the question we leave our listeners with is whether integrating privacy into a security standard is the ultimate long-term solution.
Or if truly protecting user privacy will eventually require an entirely distinct, standalone approach.
Exactly. We will let you ponder that on your own.
It is a question every data architect and, frankly, every privacy officer needs to be actively asking themselves right now.
Digital identities. We highly encourage you to visit WeCyberYou.com for more in-depth content and analysis.
There is always more to unpack when it comes to the intersection of human behavior and technical systems.
Because at the end of the day, no matter how thick the steel of the vault is, or, how perfect the plumbing of the pipeline might be, it all comes down to the integrity of the architecture itself.
Well said.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration of ISO 27701. Keep questioning the systems you build and keep questioning the systems built around you.